If there's ever an opinion that would get me cancelled and removed from the collective YouTube audience's mind as favorite Metroidvania daddy, it's probably what I'm about to say about Ender Lilies, Quietus of the Nights. This game seems to have been placed on a pedestal by many Metroidvania fans and is regarded by some as one of the modern greats, and unfortunately, I don't see it. Like, I don't hate it, but it's just alright, I guess. Aside from the pretty artwork and the novel combat system, I didn't really find much to love in Ender Lilies. And before you ask, yes, I did play the whole game, and yes, I got the true ending after collecting all the stone tablets, but I did stop just short of getting 100% completion. When I think of how I feel about Ender Lilies, one phrase continues to pop into my head: just going through the motions. Ultimately, that's just how this game felt to me. Like, don't get me wrong, Ender Lilies was fun enough to keep me engaged for the entirety of the game, and if nothing else, that's definitely a big win in this oversaturated market of mediocre titles. But as I get older and as my own free time continues to melt away in the ever-growing whirlpool of responsibility and stress, sometimes simply being engaged isn't enough. As I mentioned, this game is very well loved by a bunch of people to the point where it's suggested as one of the absolute must-plays of the modern genre. Obviously, I don't really agree with that, but it makes me wonder, is this how people who didn't get in on the ground floor of Hollow Knight feel about that game? Another game that's spoken highly of in the Metroidvania enjoyers community? I like to think that I'm not so easily swayed by popular opinion when it comes to forming my own, but there's a level of expectation that's built up around an experience when others talk it up so much before you get a chance to enjoy it on your own terms. That hype factor, no matter how much you don't want it to, can negatively affect one's perception of an experience if it doesn't speak to you in the same way that it spoke to those who hyped it up in the first place. I think that, in a way, it's unavoidable. And that's a shame, because I also wonder if my experience of Ender Lilies would have been better if I hadn't been told a million times about how good it is, and maybe also if I hadn't already seen Indy Mouse's playthrough of it a year and a half ago. The story revolves around the ruins of a kingdom overrun by a sort of plague that has infected everything and everyone. And you, as one of the last priestesses alive, are tasked with destroying and purifying the rot. It's an interesting enough story, though in true Metroidvania or Dark Souls fashion, it's told more indirectly through a series of little vignettes that you find throughout the world, or item descriptions, or even brief cutscenes that are shown to you following one of the many major boss fights. The story has basically already happened, and you're just uncovering the chapters and figuring out what you need to do to write the ending. Many people seem to love the story and the sad bits peppered throughout, and while I enjoyed them well enough, these things aren't really why I play or remember Metroidvania games. I tend to appreciate a well-crafted and interesting world full of things to discover and overcome, and the feeling that the atmosphere of the world instills in me. Obviously, this game is going for more of a somber feeling when you take in that atmosphere and the general grimness of the artwork and the vignettes, and it does a fine job at that. But more than those base emotional responses, what I want more than anything else is wonder. I want to feel like I'm encouraged to carve my way through this world and make myself more powerful as a natural, extrinsic response to the systems and upgrade paths that the game offers, and this is where I'm torn. The game does do a generally good job of rewarding players for thorough exploration with prizes like relics and relic slots, upgrade currencies, and perhaps most importantly, spirits. Spirits are your only form of offense in Ender Lilies, and where you'll be spending most of your attention when it comes to power and about how to become stronger in this game. There are a lot of different spirits in this game, and each one represents a different type of attack that you can use. Some of them are more basic attacks with unlimited uses, and some of them have a prescribed number of uses before you have to recharge them in one way or another. You can take 2 whole sets of spirits with you, with 3 spirits per set. This gives you quite a bit of customization potential throughout the game, which I think is where a lot of players might absolutely fall in love with this title. If there's any trend that I've noticed in my years of gaming, it's that people love to customize in any way possible. But for me, I don't know, man. I'm just not a fan of this system. I'm a person who tends to value highly a tightly crafted experience over something with so many variables that the developers have no choice but to leave some cracks in the balance of the game's systems because of the overall complexity. It might be why I love Hollow Knight so much and why I'm such a fan of more classic video games. And also probably why, as much as I enjoy Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I much prefer the older Zelda formula that so many people thought had gotten stale. And here's my reasoning. When you have so many possible attacks available to you in a customizable way, it's all but inevitable that some or most of them will either be unused, underutilized, or unwanted because they're either boring, too complicated, or underpowered. And what's worse is that a majority of the game's reward structure surrounding exploration and progression is based on these spirits. Either you get a new spirit, or you get the currency that allows you to upgrade them. The game does give you plenty of currency to waste upgrades here and there, but a system like this heavily encourages specialization and discourages experimentation, especially if you happen to be a gamer who might not be very quote-unquote good at video games. Most players will find what they like and stick with it, because choosing a new power represents both sacrificing a sunk cost in its upgrades and a further expenditure in upgrading your shiny new stick. And what if that new stick turns out to be crap later on? What if it gets replaced? How much more currency will you find? All of these questions represent choices that could be interesting for the player to engage with, but can be equally paralyzing or disruptive to the actual experience of playing the game. And now that I'm reading this, like, the Souls games do have a very similar problem, at least on first playthrough. But something about the design and the structure of that game makes it feel good in those games, where it doesn't feel so good, at least to me, in this one. And it's not like I didn't try to experiment with the tools I was given, but what ended up happening with me is that I found the spread of spirits that I liked that covered pretty much any scenario that I would encounter and were pretty strong, and stuck with them unless something new piqued my interest or looked like it could cover a niche better than a spirit that I was already using. But fairly often that turned into 10 minutes of trying something new, and frustratingly returning to what I know worked really well up until that point. It winds up feeling like a whole lot of content that is unable to be engaged with, and I wonder if the game would have been better off with more work put into a more limited and complete toolset than the hodgepodge we have now. All that's to say, I think that the experience and difficulty would have been tighter and more enjoyable if I didn't have to experiment and theorycraft with a bunch of attacks that I tried and then never tried again. And like I said, this aspect is probably a huge reason why other people enjoyed the game way more than I did, but it just wasn't my bag of tea, you dig? The game looks gorgeous though, well, most of the time at least. There's something almost uncanny with the motion of this game's characters. It's got the feel of lovingly handcrafted artwork, but when you see it in motion, it feels more like a group of marionettes fighting each other in a back alley, sort of stilted and clumsy. It's hard to really criticize this too harshly though, since this is an indie game, and good animation is very difficult. But what really drives this whole feeling home for me is how the motion is accentuated with the flow of this game's combat. It's actually sort of impressive how Ender Lilies strikes a balance between equally weighty and weightless, with heavy hits feeling satisfyingly slow and meaty as they collide with the enemies, but the fact that every attack roots you in place to let the animations of each individual spirit play out, even while you're in the air, means that even the heaviest attacks feel like there's no momentum or follow-through to them. It feels strange and uneven a lot of the time, and I often found myself wishing that there was more momentum in the core of the game's movement and combat to carry me through it. There's a lot of fun and interesting ideas here though, and a lot that does feel good as far as the Metroidvania progression scheme goes. One thing that Ender Lilies seems to excel at, and probably another reason why people place this so high up on their tier lists of Metroidvania games, is the freedom that the world seems to offer. After the opening areas, the game presents you with two directions to go, and around mid-game, the world seemed to open up in a big way, offering some freedom in the order in which you want to tackle the areas. Of course, in some areas you'll wind up getting cut off by an ability you don't have and will have to turn back, but as far as world design goes, I think that's my preferred method of ability gating zones. When a Metroidvania-style ability gate is done deeper into a zone, forcing a backtrack to find another direction, it can be frustrating, at least initially. It can feel like you just wasted a bunch of time on a path that you cannot explore, and like the game is punishing you for choosing wrong. But I see it differently. This was a taste of what's to come, a tease asking you to return to the area later to fully conquer it. The progress you made within the zone was not meaningless at all. You explored the map, got experience with the enemies, and now this place will stick out in your mind like a sore thumb. On the other hand, if the ability gate is what stops you from entering the zone in the first place, it can be a lot more forgettable as an obstacle that you'll want to return to later. I'm not saying one method is strictly better than the other, just that it's my preferred approach to the level design of these games. And, if nothing else, Ender Lilies does deliver pretty well in that department. On a macro scale, the world and level design is quite nice from an interconnectedness and exploration point of view, but it never quite clicked with me on a micro or room level scale. So many rooms are just massive mazes of samey-looking corridors that almost feel like they're large just for the sake of filling space. Putting more thought into it, I think it's how boring I found each individual room in this game that really soured me on the experience. It's hard to really put into words how unimpressive or uninteresting the rooms felt to me, and of course, out of everything I said in this video to disparage this game, this is probably going to get me the most flack because I'm honestly having a hard time truly explaining how it feels. It's funny to me though, because something as basic and crunchy looking as Environmental Station Alpha can make each room you explore feel like a miniature adventure through its design and how the camera and world work in congruence with each other, while something as lovingly crafted as Ender Lilies can fill me with such apathy in its moment-to-moment gameplay and exploration. There's just some it factor, I guess, that Ender Lilies was missing for me. And of course, that's the crux of things, isn't it? In the comment section of so many of my videos, I get people who are angry at what I've said and dismiss it all as, well, that's just your opinion, man. And yeah, duh, that's always been the case. There's no such thing as a truly objective review, and unfortunately, some games just don't jive with one person in the same way as they do for another person, and that's okay. And despite all the negativity, I don't think Ender Lilies is a bad game. Of course I don't. But it's not the next coming of the Metroidvania messiah that I was, in some ways, led to believe it was. It's just alright. Competent but not excellent. Good but not great. Just alright. Thanks for watching.